So, a few months ago, I made the rather bold, and in retrospect, rather incorrect prediction that a second American Civil War would start by Joe Biden's inauguration as an immediate result of the 2020 presidential election. And again, I was quite wrong when I said that. It's been well over a month since the inauguration, and I think we can pretty confidently say that a civil war is not going to happen in the immediate future. So I apologize for making such a wrong statement. I sincerely hope that nobody was unnecessarily distressed or took irresponsible actions as a result of me making that statement. And yeah. But I do not believe that I was completely wrong when I made that statement. It was wrong of me to say that a civil war definitely would happen, but I still believe that it could have happened had things been just a bit different. Had Donald Trump chosen to start a civil war, then I believe a civil war would have begun. But for whatever reason, he didn't. Maybe he finally came to his senses and realized that what he was doing was wrong, or maybe he just feared what would happen if he started a civil war and lost. But for whatever reason, he, albeit belatedly and begrudgingly, did concede, thus preventing a civil war. So at this point in the video, if you just want to leave, if you want to say that, I'm completely full of BS, I have no credibility, I made this completely false prediction before, I'll make another false prediction again, why should I stay on and watch? Then alright, I won't fault you for doing that, because, to be fair, I did lose a lot of credibility making such a false prediction. However, if you choose to stay, then I would like to show you my thought process for what I am thinking right now, starting with a brief history lesson. So the history event in question that I want to teach you, so the year is 1905, and we are in the Russian Empire, and people are revolting against the government. The immediate cause of these revolts is a day known as Bloody Sunday, in which Russian soldiers fired on peaceful demonstrators. But there are also a number of long-term causes of these revolts. Namely, there was an absolute monarchy with no representation for basically anybody but the monarch. There was a disastrous Russian foreign policy and military policy, including a humiliating defeat in a war against Japan. There was repression of ethnic minorities. There were poor conditions for Russia's urban industrial workers, including child labor and 11-hour workdays. And that was if you were lucky enough to get an urban industrial job, since most of the population were still peasants, with basically no rights and even worse conditions. I could go on, but this is not ultimately a video about Russia, so I'll stop it there. Basically, many people at the time, including future Bolshevik leader Leon Trotsky, believed that these revolts would lead to the overthrow of the Russian government. However, this did not happen in 1905. Ultimately, the revolts died out due to a combination of Russian police action as well as some minor reforms by the Tsar. So they made a limited parliament known as the Duma, and once that happened, most people could say, maybe my economic situation hasn't really improved, but at least now I can fight within the system rather than fighting against it. So, this was a lucky break for the Russian government and for the Russian Tsar of the time, Tsar Nicholas. So all he had to do now was make sure that over the coming years and coming decades, the economic conditions, the underlying causes, did get better, did improve, and once that happened, he would be able to keep his power mostly undisturbed, and he would be able to prevent a revolution. However, he did not do that. If anything, in the years after the 1905 revolts, the Russian government only got more autocratic, and they dragged their feet even more in terms of economic and social progress. So it was only a matter of time, since these issues were not resolved, it was only a matter of time until another set of revolts would come up again. And that happened. In 1917, there was another crisis, another short-term event, another cause. Russia was in World War I, they were losing World War I, and so more revolts broke out. And this time, the revolts turned into revolution, and that revolution turned into a civil war. And, well, as they say, the rest is history. This is, of course, the famous Russian revolutions, which brought the Soviet Union into existence. So why did I tell you all of that very brief summary of an event in Russian history? Well, I told you because I believe that Russia in 1905 is roughly analogous to the United States in 2021. In both cases, there was a short-term crisis and a short-term cause. In both cases, there was a short-term resolution, and so we're no longer seeing such a crisis. But in both cases, there were long-term issues which did not get resolved after the immediate crisis was over. In Russia, the Tsar didn't address the economic issues, and so just a decade later, there would be a revolution. In the United States, I hope that there will not be another crisis like that of this past year, but I believe that unless we solve some of our underlying issues, such a crisis is bound to happen. So, for the rest of this video, I will be going over some of what I believe to be the long-term issues in American society, which are bringing us toward another crisis and possibly toward another civil war. And so that's just going to be what the rest of the video is about. So I will start off with the economy, since that seems to be one of the more simple issues, if not easy to address. It's at least a bit easier to wrap your head around. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, for the average worker, have stagnated since the 1970s in the United States. Meaning that the average person has not gotten richer over the last 50 years, despite all of the economic growth and all the new technologies. And remember, that's just the average worker, meaning that half of all Americans have actually lost money adjusted for inflation in the last 50 years. So there's not really that much growth happening for the average person. We are also in an extremely competitive job market. As of before the pandemic, there was only a 60% labor participation rate, as in only 60% of the population had jobs. So that means that 40% of the population did not have jobs. And this is before the pandemic, so I'm not even factoring in what the pandemic has done, although obviously it's made it a lot worse. I've not been able to find exact statistics from since the pandemic started. But basically, 40% of the population did not have jobs, and at least that much doesn't have jobs now. Some of that percent is, of course, people who, we wouldn't expect to have jobs, like children and the elderly, but a lot of that number comes from people who could have jobs since they're able-bodied adults, but for whatever reason just can't find any, or they've stopped looking because they can't find any. And this is a complete failure on our economic system that such a large portion of the population is unemployed and can't get that income. And that's not even factoring in underemployed people who have jobs, but maybe they're only part-time or they don't pay enough to cover their expenses. So there's a lot of poverty and unemployment. And again, this was even before the pandemic. I'm sure it's gotten much worse. Then debt. There's a lot of debt in America. Consumer debt is at an all-time high at over $14 trillion. Again, some of that is not alarming, but some of it is. Some of it is debt that people don't have plans to pay back, or they can't pay back. In particular, student loan debt in America is at an all-time high, with 45 million borrowers having borrowed over $1.5 trillion in total. Many people have no way of paying this back, or even the ability to default on that debt. That's holding a lot of people back. And on a national level, our national debt is at an all-time high of over $3 trillion, and our national debt is set to overcome our GDP in just 2 years, meaning that in 2 years' time, even if everything we produce in the United States during that year just goes to paying off our national debt, it still would not be completely paid off by the end of the year. Now, I'd like to make clear that, again, not all debt is horrible, and these are not, immediately going to collapse American society. Some amount of debt is good for an economy, but only when that debt is used to fund economic growth, and when there is a clear plan of paying that back. If those conditions are not met, then debt is, of course, not good. It will hold a society back in the long term. And we are seeing that that is happening. And again, I have not found complete statistics for how the pandemic has affected the economy, but it's obviously not been good. There was an over 15% unemployment rate in mid-2020, as in over 15% of the population was looking jobs, but could not find any. And right now, 40 million Americans are currently at risk of eviction because they can't pay off their rents or mortgages. So 40 million potential potential homeless people in the United States set to become homeless. And a third of all small businesses in the United States have permanently closed in the last year. And so small businesses provide a large percent of our economy and our employment, and a third of them are closed and they're just not going to come back, even after the pandemic ends. Plus, although exact numbers are hard to find, many workers in their 50s and 60s are choosing to go into early retirement because of the pandemic. So again, these are people who could be working, but they cannot for whatever reason. And if we had a better system to take care of our unemployed people in the United States, maybe that wouldn't be such an issue, but unfortunately, we do not. Now, I would like to zoom in to a particular part of the country for a second. Although the pandemic and the economic issues have hit the entire country and the entire world in some cases, in the United States, rural communities have been hit particularly hard by many of these issues. For example, despite overall nationwide job growth between 2009 and 2020, the number of rural jobs never fully recovered after the 2008 recession. Plus, there are higher rates of unemployment in rural than in urban communities. Among working adults, there was an almost 10% poverty rate in rural communities. This is of 2015, which is more than in urban or suburban communities. And according to the official poverty rate of 2019, it was over 16% in rural areas, which is more than the nationwide average. Plus, this is not just economic issues, this is also crime. We generally tend to think of rural areas as being safer than urban areas, and it still is, on average, but violent crime is rising faster in rural communities than in any other area of the country. For example, between 2006 and 2016, in Iowa's rural communities, there was a 50% increase in the crime rate. So over just a single decade, there was a 50% increase in the crime rate in those communities. Plus, there are higher rates of drug addiction in rural communities than in urban communities. And I bring this up not to minimize the suffering of people in urban communities or in suburban communities, because poverty and drug addiction anywhere is a horrible thing to suffer through. But I'm just saying that you can't really talk about American poverty without discussing rural areas. And I'll get to the political implications of that later in this video. But let's just say that the fact that America's poorest and most desperate people they control most of America's land and most of our food supply doesn't exactly bode well for the future. So, returning to a more nationwide analysis, our physical health is also declining. It's not just our economy, but how we physically live. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, over 10 million Americans misused opioid prescriptions in 2018 alone, and over 30,000 Americans died due to opioid overdoses in 2018 alone. Currently, over 2 million Americans are addicted to opioids, and over 130 Americans die every day due to opioid-related drug overdoses. And that's not the only health issue that's worsening in the United States. Other worsening health problems include diabetes, cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, measles, pertussis, and more. In the case of the last two examples, those are actually very easily preventable. Just, take your vaccines, people. But for a number of reasons, many people are not choosing to do that, and that's just one more example of completely preventable health issues which are not prevented due to any number of reasons. I'm not going to get too deep into that, but again, it's just another example. And so, between 2012 and 2017, the death rate for adults aged 25 to 44 increased by more than 20% for multiple racial groups, and this increase is mostly due to homicide, suicide, and drug overdoses, according to the CDC. Plus, life expectancy in the US has been in decline since 2014. So, despite all the medical advancements that we've had in recent years, the American life expectancy is declining, and it has been declining even more than half a decade before the current pandemic, and of course, like with everything, the pandemic has just made it worse. So not only is our economy suffering, but physically, Americans are becoming less healthy. And then we come to an issue which is, I guess, less easy to numerically quantify, but I think it is perhaps even more damaging to the United States, that being the loss of social and psychological health. So there's a concept in sociology called civil society. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but basically, civil society is every level of organization between the individual and the government. So things like volunteer organizations and churches, nonprofits, community organizations, everything that you do with your fellow citizens, which you choose to do on your own. It's not forced on you by the government, or you're not just doing it for economic reasons. And civil society gives people purpose. It gives people a way of affecting change outside of politics. It ties communities together. If you are going with a group of people, and you are doing something, say you're running a soup kitchen, that gives you a sense of purpose. It gives you a job in your community. And it means that you don't have to rely on, say, the government to do things like that for you. And of course, the more that you do things like civil society activities, the closer you will become with your fellow citizens. And I think that this is an overall good thing for the population if there's more community activities, more communal aid. But civil society is declining in the United States. Organizations with declining membership and participation include the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. They include the Freemasons, the Red Cross. They include non-professional sports leagues, parent-teacher associations, veterans groups, labor unions, local political groups. Keep in mind I said local. National political groups have actually grown, but locally they've declined, as well as religious organizations. Currently, only about 50% of Americans attend weekly religious services today, compared to about 70% just 20 years ago, according to Gallup, and many more organizations. And I'm not saying this because I necessarily want to promote any one of these organizations to you. In particular, as an atheist, I don't really like religious organizations that much. But even I have to admit the role that they play in our society. They give people a sense of purpose in life, and they tie people to their community. For many Americans, their primary place to interact with members of their community is in, say, a church or a synagogue. And while I'd love to replace those with, say, other organizations, as it stands now, when you remove churches from the equation, people just don't replace them with anything. They get rid of the religion, but they don't make an effort to interact with their community in other sectors. And I think that this is very damaging to the country. Because, how I tie this into the whole concept of the video of another civic crisis is that civil society is the exact thing that you would want to prevent civil conflict. Because if people know each other better, then you're less likely to want to kill your neighbor who you do community events with. And if you have a way of affecting the change you want to see in the world outside of politics and violence, you are going to resort less to politics and violence. And so the country as a whole will be far less polarized and violent. And I fear that if you take away civil society, what other option do people have? Only, according to a Pew Research Center survey in 2018, only 2% of millennials know all of their neighbors. Only 20% of millennials know most of their neighbors. And 23% of millennials know none of their neighbors. And this is lower than the percent of millennials who know fewer of their neighbors is greater than older generations. Over time, people are knowing their neighbors less and less. According to a U.S. loneliness study conducted by Cigna, 54% of U.S. adults reported being often or always lonely in 2019. 69% of people in Generation Z responded that they were sometime often or always lonely. And in 2020, that number increased to 61% for adults and 73% for